The question comes in, well, who's an authentic leader? If somebody's phony, who's the authentic leader? And you describe later on in the book, which you'll get to, how you believe there's a formula for people to take personal responsibility, to lift themselves up out of poverty. And the question comes up, was it necessary to attack people as phony leaders in order to make the case that you made for the formula for personal responsibility? I mean, why was it, did you find it important to identify them as, quote, phony leaders?
Let people know what you're talking about when you're trying to make a case. And in this case, I think that there is so much poor quality leadership that dominates, especially what Professor Guinier talked about, that dominates in the media and is advanced as the face of black leadership in America. But I think it was important to, for once and for all, to burst that bubble, to say exactly, here are people who purport to represent something that I don't believe they represent. And in fact, people who I think are self-serving rather than serving the best interest of people they would identify as their constituents. So when we come to the idea of identifying people in much the way that I would identify positive, progressive, uplifting leadership, and I do in the book, I talk about the historical traditions, as you could say, identify people such as Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, who, as you well know, was a man born in slavery, love of education, goes on to be a leading voice as a journalist, but then also as a political figure, someone who persuades President Lincoln to let black people fight in the Union Army so that they can fight for their own freedom. I think again in that tradition of positive leadership, Booker T. Washington, who stood tall and said, we will even have schools on wagon wheels, we will take what we have gained from slavery in terms of crafts and trades and use them to build economic strength in the black community and in all of America. I think of W.E.B. Du Bois with his emphasis on education so that people could become part of that leadership class, as well as on organizing and building people in that leadership class into one in the form of the Niagara Movement and later the NAACP. I think of people like A. Philip Randolph. I could go on in this vein. I think of Dr. King, obviously. But this leadership is all about taking advantage of opportunity and acknowledging the strength, the humanity, the genius of black people in this country, their ability to overcome even the horrors of middle passage and slavery. Today's leadership, by contrast, Mayor Schmoke, it seems to me, those who are best known, advertised as black leaders, do not focus on opportunity. Instead, they focus on grievance. And that's when, given the media preoccupation, I think the media has a very short Rolodex. It begins with Jesse Jackson and ends with Al Sharpton. Anything happens in the black community, that's what's identified as the black leader. I thought it was necessary to say so explicitly, to say for the reader that when you look at this kind of black leader, here is what you're getting. I think you're getting people who, in fact, have limited credibility, do not work to build racial unity in the country, are identified as those who focus only on grievance, appear when there's a police shooting, or there's a problem with government action, or lack of funding for a program, and portray black people overwhelmingly as victims, rather than as people of strength and capacity in American life. I think this is a very negative image to be promoting, and yet they promote this image and say that is the authentic black leader. Anybody who talks about black people as a victim, black people as deprived, black people as part of the underclass of America, that's a real black leader, and the American media flocks to such a voice. but anybody who talks about black people as capable, intelligent, able to determine their fate, to love their families, to educate their children, oh, well, you're not really talking in the terms they're accustomed to hearing from a so-called black leader. And that's why I would identify the Mearshmallows as phony leaders. People who do not focus on strength and the grand tradition, that arc of justice I spoke about, that would allow them to truly claim the leadership mantle of Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, Malcolm X, Dr. King, moving forward.
Well, let me get to the right part. You say, along with Cosby, that the emphasis should be on personal responsibility, that personal responsibility can lift people out of poverty, and you give a formula for how that can be done. Do you want to explain that, and then I will ask Professor Guinier whether you agree that personal responsibility is the key issue?
There is a prescription in the last chapter of the book that goes like this. You should make a point of graduating from high school. Not just graduating from high school, but that should be a minimum in the year 2007 at a time of tremendous global economic competition, at a time when simply having a strong back and a will to work no longer guarantees you the opportunity to support a family in America. You must graduate from high school. That's a minimum. Obviously, I would love it if you would attend Yale and go to graduate school, get as much education as possible. But you must graduate from high school. Why do I make a point of this? Because it's a sad fact that now about 50% of black and Hispanic children in the United States are dropping out of high school. I think this is akin to jumping in the river with a bag of bricks on your back. I think it's incredible to me that somehow the message is being conveyed to young people of color in American society it's okay to drop out of high school. So number one, get that high school diploma. Don't get a GED, get a high school diploma. Step number two, stay in the job market. Stay in the job market. Don't think you're going to be a rap star or an NBA star. Stay in the job market even if your friends say that the job you have is demeaning, that you're flipping burgers. Stay in the job market. Get yourself job experience, a resume, make the connections, build a network, a professional network that will allow you to be aware when opportunities come about and prepare you to step through the doors of those opportunities and succeed. Step number three is wait until you're in your 20s to marry. And step number four, don't have a baby before you're married. Don't have a baby before you're married. Wait until you're in your 20s to marry, because it's so essential in terms of giving yourself an opportunity to get an education, to start work, to build experience that I think will pay off for you toward the end of your life. And then secondly, don't have a child before you're married, because we know well that you're not only punishing yourself, you're punishing the child, because a child that's born out of wedlock in the United States has less chance to succeed in school, more chance to drop out of school, and more chance to end up in jail. And finally, on this point, let me say that this is not a formula made up out of thin air, and it's not even made up by me. The U.S. Census Bureau says that people who share these characteristics have almost, at best, a minimal chance of living a day of poverty in the United States. And you stop and think about this, we have 25% of African Americans living in poverty as we are having this debate tonight. It seems to me this is very good news. These are concrete steps that people can take to help themselves. They don't have to wait for the next social program. They don't have to wait for the next Dr. King. They don't have to wait for somebody to say, I've got a great idea and I'm going to lead a march. These are steps that they can take to help themselves, help their children, their families, and their communities. These are the kind of concrete steps that we should be climbing to the mountaintop and proclaiming if we truly care about those who are being left behind in Black America.
Professor Guinier,
respond to the phony leader point, if that's okay.
It's your world, I'm living in it.
Well, then, thank you. I have to pause because there's so much that Juan said that I disagree with that I don't know where to start, but I think I'll start with what I do agree with. I agree that there is a lot that we can do to improve the situation of poor black people, but in the we, I would include all of the people sitting in this room, and I would include all of the people living in the United States. I would not put the burden just on the people who are in the greatest and most extreme circumstances in this country. So I think there's a lot we can do, but let's talk about we and not thee. Now, in terms of the phony leaders, because I want to start there, Juan painted a picture as if there is a single grand tradition of leadership and of a sentiment about justice in the black community. And he was very ecumenical in identifying a number of people that he felt were part of this grand tradition, from W.B. Du Bois to Booker T. Washington. And if you want to call it grand, I will go with that. And if you want to call it a tradition, I will go with that. But the problem I have is when you call it a grand tradition, as if there is a single way in which we all march in lockstep to justice and emancipation. There have been multiple traditions and multiple perspectives and multiple visions of how one can achieve justice. And it is in part the conflict and the dissension and the interaction among those many traditions that leads to vision and energy and mobilization. And I want to just give you a very short, and please excuse me for going back to history, but a short example of, to me, one of the most powerful moments in American history, which is the Montgomery bus boycott. And I know that Juan is familiar with this. He narrated an absolutely terrific set of documentaries, Eyes on the Prize, and one of the highlights of that documentary series was the portrayal of the Montgomery bus boycott. The reason I want to go back to the Montgomery bus boycott is because that boycott was not about Martin Luther King Jr., nor was that bus boycott about Rosa Parks. That bus boycott was about 50,000 black people in a single city mobilizing to boycott the buses for 13 months. Now just think about that. 50,000 black people refused to ride the buses in a single city for over 1 year. Now it is true that the boycott was first announced on the heels of Rosa Parks' arrest. But it was not Dr. King who announced that boycott. It was a combination of people I am sure you have never heard of. Joanne Robinson was the head of the Black Women's Political Caucus. She was a professor at Alabama State University. She and a number of other black women had been getting together for years saying we have to do something about these buses. And it was women who were saying we have to do something about these buses, and it was the men who were saying, well, it's not time yet. But there was one man, E.D. Nixon, who was a Pullman porter, who was the go-to man in Montgomery. And the night that Rosa Parks was arrested, he was one of the first people that she called. And after he had arranged for her to get a lawyer and made sure that she was okay, he sat down at his kitchen table, and at the same time that Joanne Robinson is at Alabama State caucusing with a group of black women at midnight, E.D. Nixon is sitting at his kitchen table with a slide rule. And he has a slide rule over a map of the city of Montgomery. And he is measuring the distance from all of the points in Montgomery, one to the other. And he gets a call about 3 in the morning from Joanne Robinson, who says, we are sitting here and we are thinking that we need to have a boycott, and we are mimeographing flyers to call the black community together so that they will boycott the buses. And E.G. Nixon says, you know, I was having exactly the same idea because I had this slide rule over a map of the city of Montgomery, and I realized there was not a single place in the city of Montgomery where a black person could live and not walk to where they worked. Martin Luther King was not part of this conversation. Rosa Parks was not part of this conversation. Now, I could go on and tell you the entire story of the Montgomery bus boycott, and I'm sure Juan could also tell you, probably more eloquently, that story. But my point is, no one was sitting around waiting for leadership. People were making leadership, and it was the fact that people came together and had networks in which they had cooperated over time, they knew each other, they pulled from the resources of the community, because middle-class black people who didn't even take the buses ultimately donated their private cars for use in the boycott, so that some of the people who were otherwise being forced to walk would have an alternative means of transportation. And they essentially built a private transportation system in the city of Montgomery. Now, there were also white people involved in this. Virginia Durr had been an employer of Rosa Parks. Now, Virginia Durr was married to Clifford Durr. He was a New Deal lawyer, liberal guy, came back from Washington to Montgomery. Virginia Durr had hired Rosa Parks as a seamstress for her daughters. And Virginia Durr was liberal, had taken to Rosa Parks and recommended to her that she take a vacation and go to a place called the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. Now, the Highlander Folk School, and not only did she recommend it, she paid Rosa Parks' way. Rosa Parks said that was an inspiration to her, because it was the first time she had been somewhere where white and black people were sitting together, working together toward a common vision. So here you have multiple people getting together with ideas about what they needed to do to solve a particular problem. But here's where I'm trying to suggest there was not a single grand tradition, just as there was not a single leader. The boycott, as originally organized, was about getting the bus drivers to be more courteous. It was not about desegregating anything. The idea of desegregating the buses was a radical notion. It was considered, when Fred Gray, the local black attorney, wanted to file a lawsuit challenging segregation, that was considered atomic warfare. That was more radical than the act of boycotting the buses. But it was over time that people came to follow Fred Gray's leadership in terms of supporting his lawsuit to challenge the segregation of the buses, as opposed to boycotting the buses simply to demand that the white bus drivers treat the black patrons with dignity and respect. There was no single grand tradition. It was a contestation, and it was a contestation that occurred with people in motion. So I agree with Juan that there are many self-serving leaders in this country, but I would not limit my focus to black people. I think most of our elected representatives from the top down are self-serving, phony leaders. So why are we focusing then simply on the black people who fit that bill? That's the definition of leadership in this country. Okay, now on to personal responsibility. I agree with Juan that it is important not to portray ourselves, anyone, simply as a victim. And I had a little opportunity to experience the wisdom of that particular advice in 1993, when President Clinton had nominated me to be Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and then withdrew the nomination without a confirmation hearing. I didn't feel too good about this experience. I had been personally humiliated. People made fun of my hair, they made fun of my name, they made fun of my ideas. Strange hair, strange name, strange ideas. I was called Real America's Mad Woman by the columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, my hometown newspaper. But I got really good advice, which in some ways tracks Juan's advice, but then I think goes beyond where he is right now. The advice came from Roger Wilkins, and he said to me, Lani, Americans do not like victims. You must not portray yourself as a victim. You have to become a woman with a cause, not a grievance. A cause, not a grievance. So I agree that there is very little percentage in portraying oneself simply as a victim where other people have done something to you and you are helpless and waiting for the same people who did something bad to you to fix it. But I would go beyond personal responsibility, because I think it's not that you are a person without a grievance and that's the end of it. You have to become a person with a cause, but it has to be a cause that other people can join. Because change in this country does not come from one person alone. The Montgomery bus boycott, which ultimately desegregated the buses in Montgomery and then inspired a civil rights movement, gave Martin Luther King a platform to be a preacher for nonviolence and to fuse the powerful idiom in the black community of religious faith with the powerful idiom in the legal community of justice. But he had a cause, and his cause was about justice. And this was about bringing people collectively and deploying the power of people collectively to pursue justice. Now, when Juan talks about you need to get yourself graduated from high school and you need to stay in the job market, even if it means flipping burgers, and you have to wait until your 20s to marry, and then don't have a baby until you are married, well, that's one philosophy of life. But frankly, that is not, to me, about justice in this country, because it doesn't go far enough. And the reason I say it doesn't go far enough, when you think about justice in this country, you cannot just focus on the people who are poor. We need to talk about the people who are rich. And the people who are rich and have aggrandized their wealth to the point that you have 1/100th of 1% of the people in this country multiplying their income and their assets over the past 20 years by over 500%, while at the same time, the bottom 25% has lost income during that period. So you have a teeny group of people multiplying their wealth, while a much larger group of people is losing ground. Now, of course, I think you should get an education. Of course, I think that you should work and lead a meaningful life. And I think it's great if you can find somebody you want to marry. But to say that that's the way everyone needs to live their life, that's not about justice, right? That's in some ways an authoritarian vision in which I'm going to tell you the way you have to live your life, but I'm not going to hold personally responsible the people who have the resources to fundamentally do something about the way in which all of us are living our lives. And I'm not picking on any one group, because when I talk about the people who have the resources, I'm talking about the media, not just individuals who are wealthy. I'm talking about corporations, which have often abdicated their social responsibilities. To me, we need to think more boldly and more transformatively about a cause, not a grievance. Thank you.